You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham. My name is Colin Piper, and we come to a particularly difficult episode for me to write because I had to get into the mind of a barren wife. It's a really important and very poignant episode, and I'd love your feedback, comments, and so do visit the website biblenovels.com and also or the Facebook page, which again is called Bible Novels. Do tell other folks about this as well. It's wonderful to be on this journey with so many folks in so many parts of the world, getting report back from places like Korea and Africa, around Asia. So thanks very much for spreading the word, and do tell more of your friends about it. Here we go. Patriarch, Chapter 4, Part 1. At first, the nights were the worst. By day, she had always found in Abram's love a dignity and worth, and now she could add faith. But by night, particularly when alone in the dark, there was no one and nothing to silence the whispering in the shadows, the persistent laughter, the doubts, the wretchedness. Remorselessly, untiringly, the questions came. Familiarity never bred contempt, and time never healed. Round and round she went in her mind, again and again, remembering, driven by the shame and guilt. She was young again, very young, Hagar's age, and just as beautiful. She was innocent, nervous, and oh so hopeful. Life lay ahead of her, and it was good. Her husband she'd known all her life. At first, as a child, she had idolized him, and then as she'd grown, so her affections had matured too into a pure and beautiful love. It was only later in life Sarai began to realize just how rare this love was, and consequently how incredibly precious was its consummation. As an innocent young woman, no more than a girl really, she thought it normal and natural that she should feel this way and things should work out this way. All she knew was he was hers for the rest of her life, and she would love him forever. He was good, strong, sensitive, respected and loving. He was all anyone could have dreamt of in a man, and having him, her dreams now moved on to what life would look like with him. He'd given her a new identity, a respect and worth that she'd never known. She would give him an inheritance. As he had fulfilled her, she would fulfill him. Abram, exalted father. A short while on, and her peers and friends began to fall pregnant. At first, Sarai's joy was unbounded, not just because she celebrated with her friends, but secretly and sometimes not so secretly, because hope and expectation rose within her. But then, every month, those hopes were cruelly dashed, and expectations were gradually replaced by doubts. At first, the doubts were vague, irritating niggles, nothing more. Then, month by month, they grew within her and began to express themselves in anxiety. Abram was the first to notice, although he said nothing. She knew he knew, and he knew she knew, and so nothing was said. Their love and love-making grew more intense, if not to influence their fruitfulness, at least to compensate for the lack of it. And it certainly bore fruit in Sarai's self-worth, if only for those cosy, intimate moments hidden by the dark and under the covers. It would, though, normally dissipate each morning in the cold light of day, and so the days became worse than the nights. As long as the doubts were hers, she could control them, But as soon as they belonged to others, they began to control her. She remembered well the first time she was aware that others may be asking questions about her. Another friend became pregnant and gave birth, and once more she joined the other women in celebrating. But for the first time she sensed an awkwardness when the conversation turned to who was next. No one said anything, and that was it. Maybe on this occasion she was oversensitive and was projecting her doubts onto others and reading their hesitation in the light of them. Maybe. But then again, the glances from one to another suggested this wasn't an unspoken awkwardness. Rather, it was one all shared and had shared. Whatever the truth of that first memory, others queued up in what had since become an accustomed order to be recalled. And these were increasingly less ambiguous. There was nowhere to hide because she literally had nothing to hide. Her failing was crudely exposed. Her flat belly and silent home said it all. She was an outsider who couldn't so easily enter into the talk of the mothers. Of course, some of them would carry on regardless, pleased to expose and exploit a weakness. Oh, but most loved Sarai and felt uncomfortable with her discomfort, and so would steer conversation in her presence away from the subject of children. Sarai, though, grew to dislike the awkwardness of both groups of peers, and like all freaks, began slowly to withdraw into her own world, which became smaller and smaller and less hopeful and purposeful. However, at this point she would recall some positives which had begun to interject. First of all, Abram, in his sensitivity, had not only understood his wife's pain, but sought to relieve it. This had driven him to question himself, his dreams and his purpose. It had driven him, she could see now, to prayer and reflection. It just might have driven him to God himself. And therefore, onto this journey, through Canaan to Mamre. If her barrenness hadn't disrupted life, would he have questioned life in Ur in the same way? Or just maybe her barrenness was more of a beginning than an abrupt end? Whatever the case, she remembered being relieved to leave Ur. She went to a new country and new people as a new person. Their lives were new. Gone was the traditional, and with it all the expectations of both Abram and her. They were different enough so that childbirth might not just be assumed to be her first and foremost purpose. And so she found a new belief, not only in herself, but also in God. And yet, her hopes in this new life, new self, new God, were to be dashed once more. Far from taking away the sense of emptiness she felt, they merely accentuated it. The journey into the land was not just to travel it, but to possess it, to people it. And this peopling was to be by Abram's seed. And so the expectations were no longer based on custom, but now divine ordinance. She was no longer just a freak, but also a failure. And not just to her husband, but also to her God. The more explicit the promises of God became, the louder the laughter from within her responded. She didn't know the origins of this mockery. Was it her laughter, or the laughter of a force greater than her? Certainly she couldn't control it. It spread through her like a disease, and soon she found herself laughing out loud, a terrible laugh. Not the contagious laughter of joy for which she'd been known. This was the laughter of bitterness, a grey, morbid laughter which cynically crushed all joy around it. Oh, she wanted to believe the promises. She wanted her faith to consume the doubts, but she couldn't. For 10 years she fought it and failed. and now she found the nights hardest again. By day she believed, but by night she would doubt. And the nights seemed to grow darker and longer until finally she gave up fighting and sought to accommodate her doubts. If she couldn't find a peace from God, then maybe she could negotiate a peace of her own. In these times of restlessness, she would call for Hagar. The young girl who had so soothed her that first night in Pharaoh's palace had become the answer to her pain. She would stand behind her, gently brushing her hair and rhythmically brushing away her cares. She would wash, anoint and massage her body and wash and knead away her doubts to replace them with the purest, freshest and most fragrant of moods. She would dress her again in the finest, cleanest, scented clothes which would cover her nakedness and just for a short time at least cover her failings as well. Of course it wouldn't last. But Sarai was appreciative to Hagar and loved her. Her youthfulness brought life, joy and even hope back into Sarai's life. Sarai fed off Hagar as though the two were one. And increasingly Sarai saw her more than just a maidservant. In their bond, the two were in fact one. Hagar wasn't just Sarai's. In a manner of speaking, she was Sarai. She was like a gift sent by God at the lowest point in her life to see her through the low points. She was his answer to her needs. And so the thoughts flowed and evolved, and slowly out of the joy and the pain came a plan. So obvious, so right, it was flawless. All Hagar knew was that she loved her mistress. She wasn't of an age or in a position to reflect greatly upon things. She could, though, recall life before Sarai, the times of joy, of uncertainty, of hard work and of boredom. She could also recall that first meeting with Sarai. She remembered sensing her mistress's fears, even anger, and remembered a strange desire in her to calm them. She remembered sensing Sarai relax as she brushed her hair, washed and dressed her, and she remembered the joy she herself had gotten from that too. Above all, she remembered Sarai looking at her as she left and asking her name. She remembered her awkwardness, covered only by the presumption of lack of language. Here was a lady, a real lady, who wanted to know her name. Never before had she felt so significant and so silly, both at the same time. She was, after all, a nobody, a maidservant with a maidservant's name. She wanted to run away, but couldn't. She also wanted to answer, but couldn't. So she froze in the doorway until she finally murmured her name with a self-conscious giggle and took herself off as quickly as she could. All that seemed a long time ago now. No longer was she ill at ease talking to her mistress. She loved her. She loved the fact she could bring peace and pleasure into her life. Her whole identity, in fact, was wrapped up in her and being her maidservant. Sarai made her complete. She couldn't imagine being apart from her ever again, and yearned for the call to serve. She hardly noticed anyone else. She was consumed with Sarai. She saw others notice her, but she didn't need them. She was aware of her beauty, but saw little to be gained from it. She had all she needed. She was fulfilled. Abram also was fulfilled. He may have been childless, but he wasn't faithless. He believed God. And what was more was being faithful to God. Given the extent of his weakness, which only he fully understood, this to him was a miracle worth celebrating. But there was much more to celebrate. Life was good. He knew a peace physically with the world about him, spiritually with his God above him, and even emotionally within himself. In fact, the only concern he had was for Sarai. He loved her more than ever, and he believed his God for her, but he was unable to comfort her in her pain. He would do anything for her, anything she asked, whatever it took, he would do, if it could bring her the fulfillment he so desired for her, and which she, his long-suffering love, so richly deserved. So when Sarai asked the question of Abram, maybe he should have thought more about it. Certainly he should have sought his God about it. But his mind had become so resolved to do anything that as soon as the question was asked, he agreed. Anyway, it evidently wasn't the sort of question which was spur of the moment, impulsively asked. It was delivered deliberately in a matter-of-fact manner which suggested careful thought over an extended period. It was odd in its origin, but not unprecedented in its asking. It was very concise in its expression, but utterly correct and logical in its reasoning. It appeared to Abram that there was only one possible answer, and so he agreed. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Later, in his defence, apart from any legal justification from his marriage agreement, Abram could have reminded himself of the look in Sarai's eyes as she lay at the table with her head resting on his chest. It was a look of excitement, pure and absolute. It told of a quest for an answer, a successful quest which had discovered a foolproof answer, and which now only required his acquiescence. There was no hint of doubt. There was a relief, a hope, and with it a glow again. For years Abram had watched these eyes darken with a tired cynicism expressed in an increasingly cold laughter. Now the light and the warmth was breaking through again. How could he say no? So he agreed. Abram, of course, knew Hagar. You could hardly visit Sarai without encountering Hagar, and once encountered, you could never forget her. There was so much about her which reminded him of Sarai when she was young. She stood slight and erect in every way. Everything about her exuded the pure, innocent beauty of youth. He liked her, though he'd hardly spoken to her, and she'd never spoken to him. He liked her, but no more than that. At least not until now. When Hagar was told of Sarai's plan, she'd had more misgivings. She was being asked to enter a whole new world. Obviously, she'd wondered about the mystery of this world, the intimacy first with a man and then, even more so, a child. Sometimes the wonder had turned to desire. But she'd never been happier than in her world with Sarai, and the fears of that new world, especially the unknowns of such intimacy, had quickly snuffed out the desire. She loved Abram, partly because of what she, like everyone else, had seen in him, more, though, because of what Sarai had told of him, and most of all because of what he meant to Sarai. So Hagar loved him, but she was scared of him. He was not part of her world. Sometimes he had spoken to her, but never she to him. She bowed, smiled, and served. He noticed her, she knew that, but not in the way others noticed her. Now she was being asked by her mistress to step out of her world into a bold new one. She was being asked not just to talk to the Patriarch, but know him. She stood confused and felt the colour drain from her face. She was being asked so much. On the one hand, she feared, and yet she knew Sarai's love, and she knew Abram, and this love and knowledge soothed her fear. On the other hand, she had to admit she was excited, not with the thought of giving herself to Abram, but with the thought of giving all she had to her mistress. she looked into Sarai's eyes and saw a joy and a glow which normally she would have had to work hard to create. This time it was there not as a result of what she'd been asked to do, but in anticipation of it, and it burned brighter than she'd seen for a very, very long time. She had the chance to give her mistress the ultimate pleasure, and even if she could have said no, she knew she wouldn't. So she agreed. The first inkling of a doubt rose up within Sarai as soon as she'd spoken to Abram, by which time it was too late. So she'd repressed it and hurried off to tell Hagar of her plan before the uncertainty had the chance to resurface. Until then, it was so obvious that it amazed her it had taken her so long to think up the plan. Her two worlds of Abram and Hagar would unite and fulfill her in the production of her child through the two people she loved most. In her mind, she dreamed of herself finally holding the child of her dreams, flanked by these two people. It was perfect, flawless. At first, the doubts were vague. There was nothing at all about Abram's reaction which might have encouraged them, and certainly one look at dear Hagar as her cheeks turned pale assured Sarai that she was in control, and all that was happening was for her, because of her, and about her. And yet the doubts grew. She sought to deny them by busying herself plotting Hagar's fertility cycle, but instead the calculations and consequent countdown merely focused her doubts further. Sarai's years of tracing the monthly moment of fertility had made her an expert of understanding any woman's cycle of fruitfulness. To her it was as clear as the night to the fullest moon was to the Magi, and coincidentally, on this occasion, Hagar's moment and the full moon were to correspond. In years gone by, when Sarai had, at least notionally, worshipped the moon as the goddess of fertility, she would have seen this as a most propitious sign. Now, she wasn't so sure. Did her God have anything to do with these old ways? Or did her plan have its origins in other spiritual forces? The doubts were now beginning to grow, and it took more resolve to quell them. Hagar was Sarai's, and her child would be Abram's seed. The plan was flawless, wasn't it?
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.